Hey everybody, we're going to do the second part of our second lesson in On Solid Ground and continue talking about why we should believe in God and believe in the supernatural. And we're going to spend some time in this lesson particularly talking about the supernatural and talking about miracles in particular. I think sometimes we think that miracles actually cause us trouble in being able to prove our faith to others and give a defense for the hope that is in us. But the truth is, there's enough evidence for miracles and evidence for believing in the supernatural because of miracles that I think it's a worthwhile thing for us to discover and to explore as we go through this series on apologetics. The truth is, mankind has long believed in the supernatural. You find this in a lot of false ways. For instance, the false gods that have been available to people through the years. You find even in Scripture a lot of mentioning of false gods like Molech and Dagon, Baal and Asherah and Merodach and Zeus and Apollo. And you find all sorts of false gods. And many of us are probably more familiar with the Greek gods or the Roman gods than we are many of the ones that preceded those in other cultures. But just think back of how many stories and how many different gods there were presented in those polytheistic religions. You get a sense of a very wide acceptance of the supernatural realm, that there was something besides our physical natural world that we can so easily interact with. And because of that, we've had a long history of miracles being believed in by the human race. They've long been used to explain the unexplainable, and sometimes I think that's in an inaccurate way. But the miracles that we do have, especially the ones mentioned in the Bible, can give us a great explanation of things that just aren't natural, things that happen not by natural means. The supernatural is really an explanation. It can be an explanation that is used by the ignorant to just say, hey, I don't understand how this happened, so we'll just say it was a miracle. But honestly, the supernatural really can be an explanation of the evidence that we've been given. And because of that, it's something for us to consider. Ultimately, though, this does go back to a worldview issue. If we accept the possibility of the supernatural, if we say, because of our worldview, that not everything has to be explained by natural cause, then if the supernatural world or realm truly does exist, then we have to admit the likelihood of miracles happening. If there is a God, if there is heavenly beings of some sort, then it is likely that those beings, including God, have interacted with us in our physical world. Now, if you want to take the more naturalistic worldview and deny that the supernatural is possible by any stretch of the imagination, it's just not something that ever could happen, well, then we deny the possibility of miracles as a result of that. So my conclusion is, if we can give reasonable evidence for there being miracles that have taken place, then we have reasonable evidence for the supernatural to be real. And if we believe that the supernatural is real, then that opens the door again to the possibility of there being an all-powerful being that we identify as God. Now, to kind of dig into this, we need to define miracles. And I'm going to define miracles as simply as possible. They are supernatural acts by God. Now that can involve a lot of things, and that still requires some defining. I recognize that. But that concept of supernatural acts performed by God, or maybe performed by God through man, that is what we would call miracles. They are by definition uncommon events. They are not events that happen every day. The idea of Jesus walking on the water was not something Jesus did every day. He didn't just go out and run across the water because he could. They were uncommon events, uncommon enough to be noticeable events. That's the thing. When something is a common event, we don't really notice it. You don't walk outside and immediately notice birds chirping or the wind blowing through the leaves of trees, because those are events that happen regularly. They are a natural part of the way things happen. But when something uncommon happens, you would notice. If you walked outside and the tree that had been standing in your front yard for the last 15 years was all of a sudden fallen over, that would be an uncommon event. And therefore you would notice it. It would be something that would draw your attention right away. But miracles are uncommon, noticeable events that we recognize don't happen naturally. When nature is caused to function in a way that is not normal, that is not the way it is typically going to function, those unexplained events, when the world does not function the way it is supposed to function and functions regularly, those are miracles. Now, another part of the definition of miracles we got to recognize is that they are purposeful events. So we're not talking about some random thing that happened that we're unsure of how it happened and therefore we're just going to call it a miracle. That would be just really an event of our ignorance, an event that we can't explain. But when an event happens that happens on purpose, by which we have no other explanation other than it was an unnatural event, that is when we would call it a miracle. And these are often done through man when we see them done in Scripture, but sometimes they are done by God to man. And we'll look at some examples, or at least mention some examples that you know from your familiarity with the Bible. But let me use the crossing of the Red Sea as an example. That was an event that happened. It was unnatural. It was uncommon. It was noticeable. It was nature working in a way that nature does not typically work. But it also had the purpose of allowing the children of Israel to cross that portion of the Red Sea and get to the other side. It was something God did. He did by the hand of Moses, and it allowed God's purposes to take place. It was a supernatural event, something that was outside of nature, that God caused to happen through man for God's purpose. That's why we call it a miracle. Now, if it just so happened that a major drought came up, and then over the course of the next 3 years, as the Israelites camped there by the side of the Red Sea, that the Red Sea eventually dried up and then they crossed over, that we wouldn't call a miracle, because it wasn't nature functioning outside of nature's normal purpose or normal order. The same thing could be said if an event happened that really had no purpose. I don't know that we would necessarily call those miracles. If it just so happened that let's say, water started draining the opposite direction. It typically drains in a clockwise direction, and all of a sudden it started draining in a counterclockwise direction. I don't know that we would call that a miracle as much as we would look for there being some sort of natural explanation, because there does not seem to be a purpose behind that particular act. And so that's the reason this definition becomes important. It needs to be an uncommon, noticeable event where nature does not function as it typically functions, and it is something that has a purpose behind it. Therefore, that's how we define it as a miracle. There have been a lot of people through history who have argued with the possibility of miracles. A few of those that I'll mention: Spinoza, he was a Jewish atheist. But he believed, and he just flat out said, there's no exceptions to the law of nature, and that makes miracles impossible. Well, that's a worldview issue. That's not really proof that miracles don't happen. That's saying that he does not believe miracles can happen, because he believes everything must have a natural explanation. David Hume, who we're going to spend a little more talking about in just a few minutes. But he argued that the probability of any exception to the natural order is lower than the possibility that the witness who saw the event was mistaken about the event. And there's some truth to that. It makes sense that it is more likely that somebody was ignorant or somebody was mistaken about what they witnessed than it was that what they witnessed was actually a miracle. We would argue that in today's terms. Somebody says that they were healed of their lame leg when they went to that tent revival. We would argue, because we don't really believe that God's doing those kind of miracles today, that it's more likely that that person was, maybe a placebo effect, maybe it was they were just duped in some way. It's more likely that they were mistaken than a miracle actually took place. Well, David Hume would argue that that's always been true and that there's never been a time of supernatural events. Patrick Lowell Smith from the 20th century argues that the miracles are merely unexplained events which eventually will learn enough by science or by study that what was assumed to be a miracle in the first place was actually just an unexplained event, and it will eventually be explained by natural means. The problem with that is there's so many moments in history and witness accounts that we have that still have not been explained, and we have no reason to believe they will be explained. Honestly, all three of these arguments refute miracles only by defining them as miracles, which doesn't actually refute them as miracles. Notice Spinoza argues that there really is no supernatural. Well, by definition, a miracle is something that is supernatural. Hume argues that miracles are just moments of, or just issues of ignorance. But again, we would argue that those people who saw those things were seeing unexplained, unnatural events. So he's just using the definition against itself. And again, Patrick Lowell Smith is arguing that the supernatural doesn't happen, which again, we would say by definition that miracles do happen. David Hume actually wrote a long paper at one point about miracles and about defining miracles and why miracles could not happen. And his first argument in that paper was that miracles are improbable. Again, we agree with that statement. We agree that miracles are uncommon events, that they're not probable events, that they are exceptions to the rules. And so he's basically taking this characteristic of a miracle and trying to use it against itself. But again, we would agree miracles are improbable. They are unlikely, but that doesn't mean they are impossible. Those are two very different statements. When you look through the scriptures and you see that the eyewitness testimonies of the miracles show that these people recognized that this was an improbable event, but that's what caused them to call it a miracle. For instance, a whole group of people saw the resurrected Jesus in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 6. There's really not much of an explanation for why that would happen unless all those people gathered together to lie about it. That this argument is faulty because it's admitting what one of the aspects of miracles actually is. He also argued that all should question the competence of those who would believe in miracles. Now again, that's a faulty argument because all he's saying is if somebody disagrees with what I believe should be true, well then I should question their competence because I'm right and that means they are wrong. That's a bad argument. That's just throwing everybody under the same weight of proof, burden of proof. What that basically says is anybody I disagree with is wrong, therefore I can disregard what they believe. That's just not a good argument. He argued that humans tend to gossip and exaggerate the truth, which leads to dishonesty and eyewitness testimony. Now again, there's some truth to this statement. People do tend to gossip and people do tend to exaggerate, But that doesn't mean that we can now just say anything we disagree with is an exaggeration of the truth, therefore we don't have to listen to it. Even within exaggerated testimonies, there is some truth. It might be an exaggeration to say that the Red Sea, whenever it was parted from this place to this place, which was 2 miles wide, when in reality it was more like half a mile wide. And we don't really know how wide the crossing was there that God made available to the people. But it is possible people could exaggerate what are the specifics of the miracle. That doesn't change the fact that the miracle took place. When Jesus calls, it's interesting in Scripture how many details there are. When Jesus calls the apostles to go out and fish and catch fish when they had not caught fish previously, it gives an exact count of how many fish they caught. There are times when the details that we're given in the eyewitness testimony is so exact that it would be hard to argue that they're just exaggerating the truth, as Hume would like to argue here. Hume also argued that eyewitness testimony of miracles are made by uneducated and uncivilized people. Again, we're running into a sweeping generalization of people, and this isn't really true. There's a lot of witnesses of miracles through history that were educated people. Luke was a doctor. Paul was a historian or a theologian. He was trained and educated in that way. Moses was trained in all the education of the Egyptians, yet he's the one who caused so many miracles to happen in the Old Testament. We know that there's a lot of people who were educated. Now, they might not be educated by modern scientific truths. They might not have today's truths, but that doesn't change the fact that they were educated and they were smart, reasoning people with the ability to understand. I find it interesting that Hume, who lived back in the 1800s, would make this kind of argument, because we could make this kind of argument about him. His rejection of the supernatural is made by a man who was only educated up to the knowledge that existed at the time Hume existed. And now that we live much later, and we live in an age of technology, and we live in a time when there have been so many other scientific discoveries, well, now we're more educated and should believe in the supernatural. It's a faulty logic to say, essentially, unless you know everything I know, you're uneducated, which is what Hume is saying. He also makes the point that competing religions appeal to different miracles to bolster their own positions. And again, there's some truth to this statement. Now, this only applies if you're trying to talk about miracles from the modern age. It doesn't really apply when you're talking about the miracles that we're speaking of as claimed in Scripture. But miracles are done. We don't have miracles being performed anymore by men. That does not mean that God cannot still do supernatural things. God can still heal. God can still cause events to work out for our good. But that idea of competing religions appealing to miracles to try to bolster their own faith, their own popularity among people, well, then that's definitely a concern, and we would probably agree with them on that. But that does not excuse the fact that miracles have taken place in history, and that there's evidence for those miracles to truly having taken place. So my question becomes, as we discuss this, is there enough evidence for us to believe in miracles? Is there enough evidence for us to believe that the supernatural things have happened? I would say yes. By modern standards, there is enough testimony and witnessing of miracles for us to believe in those miracles. The testimony we have of the miracles taking place from a historical standpoint is valid enough for us to believe them as historical events as much as we believe in the non-supernatural historical events. For instance, in some of the miracles we have many witnesses of the miracle. And sometimes those witnesses are reliable witnesses. As Hume would argue, they are educated people. But we also have what are unlikely witnesses. And what I mean by that is we have those who would agree that miracles were taking place even though they wouldn't be ones who would want to argue that those miracles had taken place by the power of the God of the Israelites. For instance, we have the biblical account, which gives a witness of the Red Sea crossing. It gives a witness of the events that were taking place during the time of Moses and the time of Joshua. We have those biblical stories there that talk about that. But we also have the non-biblical accounts of those stories. It's interesting to me that when the Israelites were going into Canaan, and they had decided that they were going to send spies in to see Jericho, we have this statement made by Rahab when the spies came and stayed in her house. It says, "I know that the Lord has given you this land." This is in Joshua chapter 2, verse 9. "I know that the Lord has given you this land, and that the terror of you has fallen on us, and everyone who lives in the land is panicking because of you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the waters of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt." Do you hear that? That is a unlikely witness or testimony of a miracle, an amazing miracle from the Old Testament. And it's not just in the Bible that we have those kind of testimonies. We have those kind of testimonies being passed around on a secular basis between the kings of those in the land of Canaan, between the kings and the Pharaoh of Egypt, where they were asking the Pharaoh of Egypt to come up and rescue them from this group of people who were coming in and trying to take over the land. And one of the miracles they would refer to are these miracles like Rahab did, of what this God had done to the kings of Sihon and had done at the Red Sea. So we have unlikely witnesses to try to appeal to show that people believe these miracles has happened. They had witnessed these miracles. We have no other plausible explanation as to how events happened except for the explanation of miracles that we have in Scripture. If there were other, you can watch certain TV channels that will try to give explanations of miracles, like with the Exodus. Maybe there was a volcano eruption that caused water to be sucked out of the Red Sea, and that if we match the timing of this to the timing of that, and then we try to make it all match up, we can come up with some sort of other natural explanation for those events that happen. There really is no other plausible explanation other than that God made it happen. And my argument has always been, even if God used a natural means to make those things happen, it's amazing that those things happened at the exact moment God needed them to happen in order to bring about the result that God wanted. Is that any less a miracle? That God worked out the details? We also have historical events happening exactly as the Bible describes them, and plenty of evidence to show them, like the Red Sea crossing, as we already mentioned. There's plenty of archaeological evidence of how the walls of Jericho fell down, exactly as the Bible describes it. Plenty of secular evidence of the flood, the worldwide flood, and we'll talk about those in some classes that are still to come. The one miracle we have to keep coming back to really is the resurrection of Jesus. And we're going to spend a whole class on this soon. But one of the things, Jesus was verifiably and believably dead. And the disciples were a scattered group of confused and fearful people. And then 3 days later, you find the tomb was empty. Even though it was inescapable, even though the stone was in place, there were guards outside of it. It was a rock-hewn stone. There was no way to escape from the inside. That tomb was inescapable, but it was empty. And Jesus was alive, and Jesus was appearing to many witnesses, including 500 at one time. All of the evidence for Jesus' resurrection is really hard to reject. And if we can believe that Jesus came back from the dead, and that miracle took place, well, then what's to stop us from believing any of the other miracles had taken place? The truth is, these miracles are verifiable based on eyewitness testimony. And if we believe in a supernatural God, if the supernatural is possible, well, then it makes sense. Miracles are probable. And they are undeniable if we believe in the inspiration of Scripture, and they are faith-building if we believe that they are logically true. There's evidence of all sorts to cause us to believe in God. We already talked about that in the first part of the lesson. And there is plenty of evidence for us to believe in miracles and plenty of evidence for us to believe. But those aren't the only reason to believe in the supernatural. If you study through the role of pain and suffering and a good God who would use those events to bring about good results, that should bolster our faith. If we understand the purpose of mankind being so different than that of creation, and that's why mankind is so different than all animals that exist on our world today, it causes us to believe in the supernatural. Science cannot answer a question that is supernatural in origin, though, because science merely studies what is repeatable and testable and observable and provable. God and miracles and the supernatural realm, that's all outside of the realm of science. So if we are depending on science to give us all of our answers, we are going to be ignorant regarding a large portion of reality. There are so many things outside of the realm of science, like psychology and sociology and history, even theoretical physics, which we'll try to do a lesson on before we're done with this series of lessons. When you look at all of that and you see all of these areas of study that cannot be proven or disproven by science, you start to realize this area of whether we should believe in God or not is not really an area that we should be turning to science for. And we're not the only ones, we believers are not the only ones who come to this conclusion. There are plenty of atheists who have studied and who have come to a belief that there is a God based on the evidence that is out there. Antony Flew spent a lifetime being a public and an outspoken atheist. And near the end of his life, here's a statement he made. I now believe that the universe was brought into existence by an infinite intelligence. I believe that this universe's intricate laws manifest what scientists have called the mind of God. I believe that life and reproduction originate in a divine source. Why do I believe this, given that I expounded and defended atheism for more than half a century? The short answer is this. This is the world picture as I see it that has emerged from modern science. Science spotlights three dimensions of nature that point to God. The first is the fact that nature obeys laws. The second is the dimension of life, of intelligently organized and purpose-driven being which arose from matter. The third is the very existence of nature. But it is not science alone that has guided me. I have been helped by a renewed study of the classical philosophical arguments. I must stress that my discovery of the divine has proceeded on a purely natural level, without any reference to supernatural phenomena. It has been an exercise in what is traditionally called natural theology. In short, my discovery of the divine has been a pilgrimage of reason and not of faith. Lee Strobel, who has become well known for his books, The Case for Christ, The Case for Faith, The Case for the Creator, said this, I'll admit it, I was ambushed by the amount and quality of the evidence that Jesus is the unique Son of God. I shook my head in amazement. I had seen defendants carted off to the death chamber on much, much less convincing proof. The cumulative facts and data pointed unmistakably toward a conclusion that I wasn't entirely comfortable in reaching, talking about his own coming to knowledge of the existence of Jesus as the Son of God. A philosopher, Dr. Ed Feser, says, as I taught and thought about the arguments for God's existence, and in particular the cosmological arguments, I went from thinking these arguments are no good to thinking these arguments are a little better than they are given credit for. And then to these arguments are actually kind of interesting. Eventually it hit me. Oh my goodness, these arguments are right after all. I want to encourage you as you give a defense for your faith, don't give up on people. Realize, like Dr. Feser there, that eventually, maybe, God will soften the hearts of these people enough to be willing to accept the evidence that God has put in the world around us, that He is there, that the supernatural is real, and that there is plenty of evidence on which we can hang our hat for why we believe what we believe.